We've done a lot of tomato canning recipes on this channel. We've done marinara sauce and salsa and tomato juice, pizza sauce, barbecue sauce, but we've never done tomato soup. So that's exactly what we're doing today. And for this canning video, we're going to be using my absolutely delicious roasted tomato soup recipe. Lots of roasted Roma tomatoes, onions, a handful of other ingredients, and it's all going to come together into one of my absolutely favorite tomato soup recipes, modified slightly to work very well for canning. So let's get right into it and start getting this recipe together. First thing we need to do is prepare the tomatoes. What I've got here is about 20 pounds of Roma tomatoes, and I need to go through the slightly tedious step of coring, cutting, and seeding every one of them. So I'll just get to slicing out the stem area of each tomato, and then slice each one in half long ways. Then using a little spoon, I'll just scoop out the seedy membrane from each half. I won't go crazy on that step, just get the majority of the seeds out of there because they won't contribute to the tomato soup texture I want. I will mention that I don't need to blanch or peel these tomatoes. You could do that step if you're going for the most ultra smooth tomato soup possible, but we're going to be blending the bejesus out of everything a little later, so I don't bother with it for my tomato soup. Once my tomato halves are ready, I'll start laying them out peel side down on baking sheets or whatever large flat baking vessels I have, because the next step is to roast these tomatoes in the oven. Roasting the tomatoes is going to slightly caramelize the sugars, leading to a broader depth of flavors in a soup that can otherwise be kinda one note. And because I'm making a pretty huge batch of soup, I have to do the roasting step in 2 phases because it all won't fit in the oven at once. So I'll load up my full-size hotel pan and a couple standard baking sheets with as many tomato halves that'll fit. Also, I didn't have the camera recording, but I also generously seasoned all those tomatoes with kosher salt and black pepper. Now they're going into the oven. I'll roast at 400 degrees for about 90 minutes, or until the tomatoes just begin to appear very lightly charred. In the meantime, we'll get our other vegetables ready. Like I said, I do not want a bland one-note tomato soup, so we're incorporating a few other great flavors into it. First, a couple red bell peppers. I'll just pull off the stems, slice them open, cut out the seeds and pithy membrane, and that's it. Next, some onions. Yellow or white work great. Today I'm using white. I'm going to cut them in half, peel them, and then cut each half into pieces. And some will consider this an unorthodox ingredient for tomato soup, but I highly recommend it. I'm talking about roasted garlic. I've got 5 whole garlic bulbs going into this batch of soup, and it's going to be amazing. Using a very sharp knife, I'll slice the entire pointy end right off, which will expose the ends of each individual clove. No need to peel, those cloves will squeeze right out after roasting. Next, I'm drizzling some olive oil over those exposed cloves and wrapping the whole thing up nice and tight in a piece of aluminum foil. I'll repeat with the other 4 bulbs, and now they're ready for the oven. When my first batch of tomatoes are finished roasting, I'll pull them out of the oven and transfer them all into a large stock pot. And I'll throw a lid on that pot to keep in all the steam and continue further softening those tomatoes. Now to load those baking pans back up with the remaining tomatoes, as well as the red bell peppers and those onion wedges. And this time I won't forget to show seasoning everything with salt and pepper. And don't be afraid of going on pretty heavy with the seasoning. I always end up needing to add a little more salt later anyway. And lastly, I'll throw those wrapped garlic bulbs into one of the pans. And now to roast, again 400 degrees for about 90 minutes. Well, except for the onions. Those white onions begin to get a little charred much sooner than the tomatoes or peppers, so I pulled those out after about 40 minutes. I just tossed them right into the stock pot with the first batch of roasted tomatoes. Okay, roasting is all done, and into the stock pot go the rest of my vegetables. As for the garlic, they're ready to unwrap and also add to the pot. I'll do this by carefully squeezing the outside, which pushes all of those soft, amazing roasted garlic cloves right out. I do recommend letting that garlic cool a bit first, or at least use some paper towels or something to insulate your hands, because those things are pretty molten hot at this point. Once all the veg and garlic is in the pot, it's time to move over to the stove. I'm going to get this pot over medium heat and let everything start to simmer. I'll give it a couple stirs, but it will be pretty difficult to do so until it's all cooked down and softened a bit more. While that's happening, I'll get my jars sanitized. I've just got them in the canning pot, and I'll bring that water up to a simmer for a while. This step isn't technically necessary since I've got a pretty long processing time, which will in itself sterilize the jars. But I like to get those jars nice and hot before putting hot stuff in them, and it also heats up the canner water so it's ready to receive those hot jars. Anyway, once that veg mixture is simmered for about 15 minutes, I'll throw in a couple more ingredients. First, a tablespoon of balsamic vinegar and about 20 leaves of fresh basil. I'll stir it all in, and now it's time to blend. The blending step can be done in a number of ways. A high-powered countertop blender is going to do the best job, but first I like to go at it with an immersion blender to give it a bit of a preliminary blend. This is going to get the majority of the solid vegetables somewhat pureed and make it all much easier to transfer to the countertop blender. Just keep in mind that this is all piping hot, so be very careful not to splash or spray yourself with this tomatoey napalm. Now I'll start ladling the mixture into my countertop blender. I'll have to do it in about 4 batches since, again, I'm making a ton of soup here. I'll process each blenderful on the highest speed for a good minute until it's as smooth as this machine is capable of. Then I'll pour out the blended soup into a separate pot as I go and just repeat until everything has been thoroughly blended. One quick pointer: examine your blender to identify whether its lid has a small pouring spout that can be accessed via a little hinged hatch. If it does, I highly recommend keeping a hand or finger on that little hatch to ensure that it cannot suddenly get blasted open, thereby showering molten tomato soup upon your walls, ceiling, cabinets, floor, and camera equipment. I've heard that this can create a massive mess and be a huge pain in the butt to clean up. Anyway, I'll take my pot of blended soup and get it back on the stove. I'll just bring it to a very low simmer for about 10 minutes, stirring regularly. This is also the time to taste for seasoning. After giving it a quick taste, I definitely want to add a great big pinch of kosher salt to it. Now it's tasting perfect and we're just about ready to can. But real quick, I want to mention an optional step you can take if you want to make your soup extra smooth. I don't mind my soup having some texture, but if you like yours really silky smooth, similar to what you'd get if you bought it in a can, just push it all through a fine mesh metal strainer. Using the back of my ladle, I'll gently press it all through my fine metal strainer, just doing a little at a time. The pulpy stuff that remains in the strainer, well, you can discard it or save it to use for something else. This will reduce the overall quantity of your batch by a noticeable amount. I'd likely lose about a quart of soup if I filtered all of it in this manner. Okay, time to start canning. I'll carefully pour the water out of my simmering jars and move each one over to a couple of towels on the countertop. Now, this recipe is mostly tomato, which is pretty acidic, but we're going to be water bath canning, so we want to ensure that there is definitely enough acidity in our food so it's shelf stable and safe to eat. So I'm using some trusty citric acid powder like I do with most of my canned tomato foods. I'll just drop a half teaspoon of that powder into each quart jar. Then I'll go ahead and start ladling in my soup. I'll fill each jar almost to the top, but making sure to leave 1/2 inch of headspace. After the jars are filled, I'll go through and check that headspace with my headspace measuring tool. The center notch is for 1/2 inch, and it looks like a couple of these need a little more, so I'll spoon in a bit at a time until I'm at that 1/2 inch mark. Now, using the other end of that tool, I'll debubble each jar. That just involves running this tool around the inner surfaces of each jar and giving it all a gentle stir. This just helps to dislodge any stubborn air bubbles that might be trapped down in there. Next is the very important step of wiping the jar rims. Using damp paper towels, I'll very thoroughly wipe the top edges of each jar extremely clean. I'll keep wiping with clean parts of the paper towel until I see absolutely no more red. A little soup will inevitably splash and spill as I'm doing the previous steps, and I need to make absolutely sure that there is no soup or even soup residue sitting on the top edge of the jar, which will inhibit a very good seal between the jar and the lid. Lastly, I'll set each lid in place atop the jars and screw on the metal rings. I'll tighten them a little bit so they're snug, but you should not crank them down super ultra tight. Now the jars are ready to go into the hot water bath canner. But there's one last step I like to do first, which practically guarantees that none of my jars are at risk of cracking. The water in this canner is still quite warm because it was simmering those jars until a few minutes ago. The jars are quite warm because they were being simmered, not to mention filled with hot tomato soup. So I like to use my digital infrared thermometer to quickly check the temps of both the canner water and the jar itself. If these temps are too far apart, we risk glass breakage. Putting hot jars in cool liquid or cool jars in hot liquid is a recipe for broken glass, and this basically removes that risk altogether. It looks like my canner water is coming in at 150 degrees and my jars are reading about 138 degrees. That's pretty close, so I feel comfortable plunging those jars into the water. If the temps were further apart, I would just add some cool water to the pot to lower its temp, or turn on the heat if I needed to raise the temp. Anyway, I'll carefully set each jar into the canner. I want to take care to make sure the jars aren't touching the outer walls of the canner, and ideally not touching one another. And it looks like my water level is a little too high. Once this starts boiling, it's definitely going to spill over. So I'll remove a bunch of that water until the level is about 1 inch above the top of the jars. That's looking pretty good now. So I'll turn the heat on high and get this water up to a full rolling boil. Only once it reaches a full boil has the processing time begun. This recipe needs to process for 80 minutes or more if you are at high altitudes, so we'll come back once the boiling has started. Okay, it's boiling away, so I'll put the lid back on and start my timer for 80 minutes. Now it's 80 minutes later, so I've got the heat off and the lid to the canner removed. I'll let these jars sit here for about another 5 minutes to just start cooling a little bit before I remove them. At which time I will carefully move the jars out of the canner and onto a folded towel on the counter. This towel protects the counter from the hot jars, but also protects the hot jars from the cold counter. Now I just have to let these jars sit here until they're completely cooled to room temperature. This will take many hours. In the meantime, each lid will pop, which is the center of the lid being sucked inward, thereby signaling a sealed jar and a successful canning. And of course, if any of the lids do not pop, that jar is not sealed successfully and cannot be considered shelf stable. If that happens, you can put on a new lid and try processing again, but on the rare occasion that I get a failed seal, I usually just put that jar in the fridge and use it within the next week or so. Failed seals don't happen often, but they happen sometimes, and they happen to everyone. All of these jars did successfully seal, and once cooled, they are ready to use or store in the pantry for later use. Finally, be sure to write today's date on the lid and always store your jars with the metal rings removed. So that's about it. If you want to see the full printable recipe for this roasted tomato soup, I'll put a link in the video description below. Be sure to like and subscribe and stay up to date with all our latest stuff, including future cooking and canning videos. And consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/Great Lakes Country. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'm John, and this is Great Lakes Country.